The alarms started at 7:43 in the morning. I know the exact time because I was already at my desk, already watching the server dashboards, already seeing the numbers climb past the threshold I had been warning about for months. Within 4 minutes, the operations system went completely dark. Orders froze mid-process. Client portals locked out. Every dashboard in the building went blank. By 8 o'clock the executive team had assembled in the main conference room. I was called in 6 minutes later. The room was tense in the way that rooms get when expensive things are breaking, and nobody knows how to stop them. My manager, Brandon, was standing near the head of the table. When I walked in, he turned toward me and said, in front of the 7 other people in that room, "This is what happens when engineers overcomplicate things." He let that land for a moment, then added the second part. "You spent months predicting problems. Maybe try fixing one instead." The room produced the specific kind of laughter that people use when they're nervous and want to seem unbothered. I looked at the failure data scrolling on the wall screen. The failure mode. The cascade sequence. The exact vulnerability. I had described all of it. In writing. 6 months ago. While the executives argued about recovery timelines and client communications, I opened my laptop and navigated to my email archive. I had been keeping a sorted folder for 14 months. I found what I was looking for in under 30 seconds and turned my screen, so it faced the center of the table without saying anything. The email was dated 6 months and 11 days earlier. The subject line read, "Critical system failure risk, immediate attention needed." The body of the email was 4 pages long. It described in plain, specific language the exact vulnerability that was currently displaying itself on every screen in the building, the way a traffic surge above a certain threshold would trigger a database desynchronization, how that desynchronization would cascade through the 3 dependent systems, and what the resulting failure would look like from the outside. I had included projected timelines, estimated client impact, and a proposed remediation plan with costs. I had sent it to Brandon and copied 2 department directors. Brandon's reply was visible directly below my email. 2 words. "Stop worrying." The conference room went very quiet. Not the nervous quiet from a minute earlier. A different kind. The kind that happens when a room full of people is recalculating something they thought they already understood. My name is Soren Webb. I had been the lead systems analyst at the company for 3 years, and I had joined when the infrastructure was in a state that politely could be called fragile. The database architecture was patched together from 3 legacy systems that had been merged without proper integration. The monitoring tools were outdated. There was no documented disaster recovery plan. In my first 8 months, I rebuilt the core database structure, implemented automated monitoring across all primary processes, and documented the system architecture end-to-end for the first time in the company's history. I also stabilized 2 systems that had been experiencing monthly crashes so consistently that the operations team had started treating them as routine. The result of all that work was that the systems started performing reliably, which, I would eventually understand, was a problem in a specific way I hadn't anticipated. Because once a system performs reliably, the people who depend on it stop thinking about why it performs reliably. They start treating reliability as a property the system simply has, like a chair has 4 legs, rather than something requiring ongoing attention. That belief was very comfortable and very wrong, and it would take a catastrophic failure to replace it with the truth. The first serious warning came about a year before the collapse. I was running routine load analysis when I discovered something that made me run the numbers twice. The company had grown significantly over the previous 18 months. New clients, expanded transaction volumes, 3 new product lines. The growth was real and the business team was rightly proud of it. But the system's core architecture had been designed for a company roughly half our current size. I ran a series of stress simulations. The results were consistent and alarming. At peak traffic levels, which we were approaching on a quarterly basis and would exceed within 6 to 9 months, the primary database server would begin experiencing synchronization lag. If traffic continued to climb while that lag was unresolved, the database would eventually desynchronize entirely, triggering a failure cascade across all dependent processes. I wrote a 12-page technical proposal for a full infrastructure upgrade, phased, costed, and time to complete before we reached the critical threshold. I submitted it to Brandon on a Tuesday. He called me into his office on Wednesday, and rejected it in the first 90 seconds. "Too expensive," he said. He didn't ask me to walk him through the risk assessment. He said, "Too expensive," and closed his notebook. I didn't stop there. I came back 3 months later with a scaled-down version of the proposal. Not the full upgrade, just the most critical component. A database partitioning change that would isolate the highest risk process and contain a potential failure before it cascaded. The cost was a fraction of the original proposal. The implementation time was 2 weeks. I presented it in a team meeting with a clear summary of the risk it addressed. Brandon listened. Then he said the system was performing fine, and that I was exhibiting technical paranoia. That phrase, technical paranoia, was the one that stuck. Not because it was particularly cutting, but because of what happened next. After that meeting, I started noticing that I was being excluded from certain leadership briefings. Updates that had previously included the technical team began arriving with summaries only. No raw data, no underlying reports. When I asked about this, I was told the format had been streamlined for executive audiences. What it actually meant was that Brandon had become the filter. Everything technical was going through him before it reached anyone above him. And Brandon's version of technical information had begun to bear only a passing resemblance to the actual situation. I mapped the pattern carefully over the following 6 weeks. I compared what I was sending to Brandon against what appeared in executive briefings, the summaries he sent to the VP of Operations and the department directors. The gap was consistent and significant. A report I had filed describing elevated risk of cascading failure under high-load conditions became, in Brandon's summary, some minor performance optimization opportunities. A risk assessment I had submitted with a severity rating of high became routine maintenance items the engineering team is monitoring. A recommendation I had flagged as urgent was relabeled an ongoing area of technical interest. Every critical term had been softened. Every urgency marker had been removed. The executives were receiving a fundamentally different picture of the system's health than what the actual data showed. And because the executives trusted Brandon's summaries, because that was what their reporting structure was designed to do, they had no reason to question what they were being told. The system, in their understanding, was fine. It was performing. Their analyst was raising preferences, not emergencies. I understood, sitting with that mapped comparison, that the problem was no longer just technical. It had become organizational. And organizational problems required a different kind of documentation than technical ones. That same week, I changed my approach to documentation. I had always kept records. Engineers keep records, it's part of the job. But I had been keeping them in the company's internal project management system, which Brandon had access to and could theoretically edit or archive. I started keeping a parallel personal archive. Each significant email I sent, I forwarded to my personal account within the hour. Each risk report I filed, I saved a copy to an encrypted external drive I kept at home. I started adding language to my internal reports that made the risk ratings and severity levels explicit and unambiguous. Not technical jargon that could be reinterpreted, but plain descriptions. This failure mode, if triggered, will result in a complete system shutdown. Duration: estimated 4 to 12 hours. Client impact: all active transactions suspended. I also started timestamping my own records in a separate log, a running document I updated each time I submitted a warning or recommendation, noting the date, the content, the recipients, and any response I received. At first this felt excessive. 3 weeks later, management approved a configuration change that made everything I had documented feel absolutely necessary. The configuration change had been proposed by a vendor who was trying to improve our performance benchmark scores before a client audit. The change involved adjusting the database query caching protocol, a modification that would reduce average query response time by about 12% under normal conditions. Brandon authorized it without consulting the engineering team. I found out from a colleague who had been asked to implement it and came to me because something about the parameters didn't look right. I reviewed the change immediately. The 12% performance improvement was real. What the vendor's documentation didn't mention, or mentioned only in a footnote, in language that was technically precise but practically obscure, was that the caching adjustment reduced the system's tolerance for concurrent high-load requests. Under peak traffic conditions, the reconfigured system would reach its failure threshold approximately 30% faster than the original setup. I wrote a detailed memo documenting this. I described the risk in specific terms and sent it to Brandon with a formal request to reverse the change or delay it until a compensating mitigation could be implemented. Brandon responded by email 2 days later. He said the vendor had confirmed the configuration was within acceptable parameters and that I should trust the process. There was a meeting in the third month before the collapse that I have thought about many times since. It was a quarterly operations review. Brandon, the VP of operations, 2 department directors, and a group of senior engineers including me. Brandon was presenting the system health summary. The metrics looked good. Response times were down, uptime was up, client satisfaction scores had improved. He described the infrastructure as stable and scalable. At one point the VP of operations asked whether there were any risks on the horizon that the team was monitoring. Brandon said, "Nothing critical. A few things the engineering team keeps an eye on, but nothing that warrants leadership attention." Then, addressing the room more broadly, he said something I wrote down verbatim as soon as the meeting ended. He said, "If anything breaks, we'll figure it out then. Not if. Then." He had used the conditional form of the word while actually expressing certainty that something would eventually break, and he had paired it with a plan that consisted entirely of reacting rather than preventing. The VP nodded and moved on to the next agenda item. I sat in that meeting and understood something clearly. They were gambling with a system they did not understand, using client relationships and transactions as the stakes. 2 weeks before the collapse, I sent what I privately acknowledged at the time might be my final attempt at a formal warning through internal channels. I had spent 4 evenings preparing the document. It was 12 pages, structured as a technical risk brief. It included a precise description of the failure mode, the exact traffic threshold that would trigger it, a projected timeline based on current growth trends, a detailed impact assessment covering client exposure and transaction risk, and a section comparing the cost of the proposed remediation against a conservative estimate of the cost of the failure it would prevent. I sent it to Brandon, copied the VP of operations and both department directors directly rather than routing through Brandon, and flagged the email with high importance. Brandon forwarded it to the executive group the following day with a one-line note attached. The note said, "Overly dramatic. Engineering team has things well in hand." The VP of operations did not reply. One department director sent a brief acknowledgement. The other did not respond at all. I printed the email thread, the delivery confirmation, and the forwarded version with Brandon's annotation, and added them to my personal archive. Then I went back to monitoring the dashboards and watched the traffic numbers continue to climb. The marketing campaign launched on a Monday. The company had spent 3 months preparing a major client acquisition drive, targeted ads, a referral program, a discounted onboarding offer. It was well executed, and the response was significant. By Tuesday morning, traffic had tripled. I was watching the server dashboards from the moment I arrived at my desk. The primary database server load was climbing steadily. By 9 a.m. it had passed 60% capacity. By 10:30 it was at 78. The desynchronization warning I had described in my reports, the early indicator that precedes the cascade failure, appeared at 11:14 as a small yellow flag in the monitoring interface. I sent an immediate message to Brandon. Database desynchronization warning active. System approaching failure threshold. Immediate action recommended. I sent a second message to the VP of operations directly, flagging the situation as critical. I sent both messages at 11:17. Brandon read my message at 11:23. I could see the read receipt. He did not respond. The VP of operations did not respond. At 11:41, the database desynchronized fully. The cascade began. Within 4 minutes, the entire operations system went dark. The timestamp on my last warning message and the timestamp on the system failure were 24 minutes apart. The failure was total and it was fast. When the database desynchronized, The first system to go was the order processing platform. Every active transaction suspended mid-completion. The client portal lost its authentication connection 17 seconds later, locking out every user simultaneously. The reporting dashboard the operations team used went blank 40 seconds after that. 3 dependent integrations, a payment processor, a logistics partner, and an internal communications tool, all lost their data connections within the first 2 minutes. What I had described as a cascading failure across all dependent systems was not a metaphor. It was a precise description of what happened, in the order I had specified, in the time frame I had estimated. I sat at my desk for a few minutes after the collapse began, and looked at the blank monitoring screens. I did not feel satisfied. Satisfaction would have required wanting this to happen, and I had spent 14 months trying to prevent it. What I felt was the absence of surprise, the particular flatness of watching a predicted thing occur. Then I opened my documentation folder, confirmed that everything was in order, closed it, and walked toward the conference room where I could already hear the raised voices of people trying to understand what had just happened. The emergency meeting was chaotic for the first 10 minutes. Executives were arriving in stages, each one receiving a summary of the situation from someone else, which meant 4 different versions of what had happened were circulating simultaneously. Brandon was at the front of the room attempting to control the information flow. He described the failure as the result of an unexpected traffic surge that had exposed latent weaknesses in the system design. The phrase system design was doing a lot of work in that sentence. The VP of operations, a focused man named Gerald, cut through the noise with a direct question. Is this a design failure or a maintenance failure? Brandon said it was a design issue that the engineering team had been working to address. Gerald asked a follow-up that changed the temperature of the room immediately. He said, "Did we receive any formal warnings about this type of failure before today?" Brandon started to answer. Before he could finish the sentence, I spoke. I said, "Yes. The first warning was filed 14 months ago. The most recent was 24 minutes before the failure began." I opened my laptop and turned the screen so it faced the center of the table. The archived reports were already pulled up. I walked the room through the documentation without editorializing. I showed them the original risk proposal from 14 months ago. I showed them the scaled-down recommendation from 4 months later. I showed them the memo about the configuration change. I showed them the 12-page risk brief from 2 weeks before the collapse. I showed them the message I had sent at 11:17 on the morning of the failure, with the read receipt showing Brandon had opened it at 11:23, and the system failure log timestamped at 11:41. I did not make any statement about what the sequence meant. I didn't need to. The room read the documents in near silence. Gerald asked me to scroll back to the email I had sent 6 months earlier, the one with the 4-page technical breakdown. He read the subject line aloud. Then he looked at Brandon. He didn't ask a question. He just looked. Brandon said the warnings had been assessed and determined not to require escalation. Gerald asked what criteria had been used to make that assessment. Brandon said the engineering team had been monitoring the situation. Gerald said, "The desynchronization warning was active 24 minutes before the failure. What happened in those 24 minutes?" The room went quiet in the way that means an answer is expected, and has not arrived. Brandon attempted several different framings over the following 15 minutes. He said engineers routinely flagged concerns that turned out to be manageable. He said the company had a process for evaluating technical recommendations, and that process had been followed. He said the marketing campaign had produced traffic volumes beyond what anyone could have reasonably projected. That last one was the one that caused Gerald to open his own laptop. He pulled up the risk brief I had sent 2 weeks before the collapse and read a single sentence aloud. The one where I had included a projected traffic range based on current growth trends, and where the upper end of that range was within 8% of the actual traffic volume that had triggered the failure. Gerald set the laptop down and looked at the room. He said he wanted the full communication logs between the engineering team and department leadership, reviewed by end of business. He said he wanted every risk report, every recommendation, and every response to those recommendations compiled and presented to him the following morning. He said this directly to HR and the head of the internal review team, not to Brandon. Brandon was still standing near the front of the room. He had stopped speaking. The internal review launched formally the following morning. I was interviewed first, a 2-hour session with Gerald, the head of HR, and an outside consultant who specialized in organizational risk assessment. I brought my personal documentation archive on a USB drive and submitted a full copy. I walked them through the complete timeline without omitting anything, including the parts where my approach had been imperfect or where I had failed to escalate beyond Brandon. I thought honesty about the full picture was more useful than a selective account, and I believed Gerald was capable of evaluating a complete picture fairly. The review team then spent 4 days going through the company's internal systems, every email in the relevant threads, every version of every report submitted or forwarded, the full communication log between Brandon and the executive team over the previous 14 months. I knew what they would find. I had been watching it accumulate in real time. But knowing what they would find and seeing the expression on the review consultant's face when she came to ask a follow-up question on the 3rd day were different things. She asked whether I had been aware that my risk reports were being materially altered in Brandon's summaries to the executive team. I told her I had documented my suspicions about that for the past 8 months. The review team's findings were specific and documented. They confirmed that I had submitted formal risk warnings through appropriate internal channels on at least 11 separate occasions over 14 months. They confirmed that Brandon had received each warning and had responded to most of them in ways that minimized or dismissed the concern. They confirmed that in his communications with the executive team, Brandon had consistently represented the risk level as lower than the technical documentation supported, removing urgency markers and reclassifying formal risk reports as routine maintenance observations. The review also identified the configuration change from 3 months before the collapse as a significant contributing factor, approved by Brandon without technical review, over the explicit objection I had filed. The consultant's summary included one sentence I read several times when I eventually saw the full report. It said, "The pattern of communication identified in this review represents a systematic suppression of technical risk information over an extended period, creating a decision-making environment in which leadership was structurally prevented from understanding the actual risk profile of the systems they were responsible for." That sentence described what I had watched happen from the inside. Seeing it described from the outside, in those precise terms, was its own kind of clarity. While the review was running internally, the company was managing an escalating client situation externally. The system had been down for 9 hours before partial restoration, and 14 hours before full functionality was recovered. During that period, an estimated $3 million in client transactions had been delayed or suspended. 2 enterprise clients had filed formal complaints. One, a logistics firm that processed time-sensitive freight payments through our platform, had invoked a service-level agreement clause and was formally requesting compensation. During a client call that week, the logistics firm's VP of technology asked the company's account team directly, "Did anyone on your technical team foresee this type of failure?" The account team, not knowing how to answer, had forwarded the question internally. Gerald had made a decision I did not expect. He authorized the account team to share my 12-page risk brief, the one from 2 weeks before the collapse, with the client. The client's VP of technology read it and called back the same afternoon. He said it was one of the most precise failure predictions he had seen documented in a production system environment. He asked if the engineer who wrote it was still with the company. When he was told yes, he asked if he could speak with me directly. The conversation with the logistics firm's VP changed the dynamics inside the company in a way that was visible and fast. After the call, Gerald asked to meet with me privately. He said the client had specifically requested that I be involved in any technical communications going forward. He said 2 other enterprise clients had made similar requests after word had circulated through account management channels. He said the investigation had made the pattern of the preceding 14 months unmistakably clear, and that he wanted me to know the company's response was going to reflect that clearly. For the first time since the collapse, I felt something loosen slightly in my chest. Not relief exactly, but the beginning of it. Meanwhile, Brandon had become largely absent from the operational response. He had been asked to step back from leading the recovery effort on the 2nd day, without public announcement, and had been replaced by an interim technical lead while the review concluded. His name stopped appearing in project communications. His presence in the office became noticeably reduced. The people who had laughed nervously in the emergency meeting when he had mocked my warnings were now the ones coming to my desk to ask about the recovery timeline. The shift in the room's orientation was so complete it felt almost disorienting. Brandon called me on the evening of the 8th day after the collapse. I was at home, working through recovery documentation. I saw his name on my phone and answered because I had expected the call, and was curious what he would say. His voice was controlled, but the control was audible, the effort of it more visible than the composure it was meant to produce. He said he wanted to talk through the situation. He said the review process had gotten complicated, and that he thought it would be helpful for me to provide context to leadership about the technical complexity of the decisions made over the previous year. He said much of the criticism was based on documentation that didn't account for the judgment calls engineers and managers have to make in real-time operating environments. He said leadership respected my technical knowledge, and that my perspective on the challenges involved could help bring some balance to the review findings. He chose his words carefully, but the meaning was clear. He wanted me to present the decisions that had led to the collapse as more ambiguous than the documentation showed them to be. He said he thought there was a path forward that would be good for everyone. I told him I would think about it. I gave myself one night. The offer arrived by email the following morning, drafted through an intermediary rather than directly from Brandon, which told me how the previous 14 months had ended up teaching him one lesson if nothing else. The email described a promotion, a new title, Senior Infrastructure Director, which was a level above my current role and came with a team of 4 and a 15% salary increase. The role description was substantive, and the compensation was real. The condition was embedded in the third paragraph, under Role Expectations. It said the position would require the new hire to provide executive leadership with balanced technical assessments that account for operational context and business realities. That phrase, balanced technical assessments, was doing precisely what Brandon's summaries to the executive team had done for 14 months. It was using careful language to describe a specific result, that I would be expected to soften, qualify, and contextually dilute risk information before it reached the people responsible for acting on it. The role was real. The condition made it something I could not accept. I declined the offer in a brief, professional reply that same morning. Then I forwarded the full email thread to Gerald's office with a short note. I said I wanted to make sure the review team was aware of the communication. Gerald called me directly within 2 hours of receiving the forwarded email. The conversation was brief and specific. He said the offer and its conditions were something the review team needed to evaluate as part of their findings, and he thanked me for making it available. He said the review was concluding within the week, and that he wanted to speak with me about next steps before the conclusions were finalized. He asked if I was available Thursday afternoon. I said yes. When I arrived for that meeting, Gerald was at the conference table alone. He did not have the HR director or the outside consultant with him, which told me the formal review phase was over, and we were now in a different kind of conversation. He confirmed that the review findings would be presented to the full executive team the following Monday. He said the findings were clear, and that the company's response was going to reflect them fully. Then he asked me a question that was direct and practical. He asked whether, given everything that had happened over the preceding 14 months, I was still interested in building the system I had been trying to build. I said yes. He said, "Good. Because we need you to lead it." The formal conclusions of the review were presented to the executive team on the following Monday morning. I was not in that meeting, but Gerald briefed me on the outcome the same afternoon. The review had concluded that the system collapse was the result of a documented and preventable failure that had been predictable based on information available to the company for over a year. It concluded that formal risk warnings had been received, filtered, and materially misrepresented to executive leadership by department management, preventing informed decision-making at the level responsible for capital allocation and risk approval. It concluded that a configuration change had been authorized without appropriate technical review, in explicit contravention of a formal engineering objection. Brandon was removed from his position effective immediately. The removal was described in the internal communication as a restructuring, but everyone in the technical team understood what it was. The VP of Operations issued a formal statement acknowledging that critical information had not reached the appropriate decision-making level, and that the company's internal communication processes would be restructured to prevent recurrence. My risk reports, all 11 of them, were entered into the company's official incident record as documented prior warnings. 3 weeks after the review concluded, Gerald and the executive team asked me to lead the full infrastructure rebuild. The resources they allocated were substantially what I had requested in the original upgrade proposal 14 months earlier, the one Brandon had rejected in the first 90 seconds without reading the full risk assessment. The difference was that this time the budget had been approved at the executive level before the conversation with me, not as a negotiating position, but as a commitment. They also gave me something the proposal hadn't included: direct reporting access to Gerald, bypassing the middle management layer that had filtered every technical communication for the previous year. I accepted the role with 2 conditions of my own. I asked that the risk reporting framework be restructured, so that severity-rated technical warnings above a certain threshold could be submitted directly to executive leadership, without routing through department management. Gerald agreed without hesitation. I asked that the new system documentation include a formal review process, requiring executive sign-off on configuration changes that affected core infrastructure. He agreed to that too. We shook hands. I went back to my desk, opened a new project file, and started building the plan I had been ready to build for over a year. A year after the collapse, the rebuilt system handled 10 times the peak traffic load of the old one, without a single critical failure. The architecture was clean, the monitoring was comprehensive, and the escalation protocols were documented, tested, and working. During an all-hands meeting, the CEO talked about the past year. He talked about the collapse, about the lessons it had produced, and about the rebuilt infrastructure. He said something near the end that I wrote down afterward, because I wanted to remember it accurately. He said, "We had the information we needed. We just didn't listen to it." I thought about the morning of the collapse, the alarms, the blank dashboards, Brandon's voice saying, "Maybe try fixing one instead." I thought about 14 months of warnings. I thought about the email with 2 words in reply. I had not been dramatic. I had not been paranoid. I had not been overcomplicating things. I had been reading a system accurately and reporting what I read. The only difference between prevention and collapse had been whether the people with authority chose to act on what they heard. In the end they did. Later than they should have. But the system I built after that was designed to make sure they could never again claim they hadn't been told.